and welcome. I am Catherine Maggs, and welcome to Continuing the Conversation, which is a conversation series dedicated specifically to continuing the conversation around the themes dedicated to International Women's Day. This year, International Women's Day's campaign theme is Break the Bias. And like all years past, there's always a lot of conversation and frenzy that leads up to and during the week that International Women's Day actually falls. But often, this is usually where the conversation ends until the next year. So I am continuing the conversation by interviewing amazing humans around the world to better understand what break the bias means to different people in different circumstances, how they see bias play out in their lives, and what they're doing both personally and within their organisations to help break the bias. If you would like to continue the conversation with me, I'd love to hear you. So please send me a message or an email, which you can see the details below. Today, I'm talking with Gavin Martin. Gavin is a chartered management accountant with a proven track record in leadership, customer delivery, and continuous improvement within financial services across various sectors and industries. Gavin has pursued his career in a range of roles, strategically and operationally, to ensure a balance between financial discipline, risk management, execution, driving efficiency, and strategic growth. So let's get started. Welcome everybody to continuing the conversation around Break the Bias. I have with me today Gavin Martin. He is Head of Risk with Suncorp Group, and he also plays a key role in the gender inclusion practitioner stream within Women Connect within the organisation. So thank you, Gavin, for being part of this.
Thank you for having me. Very pleasure. Pleasure's all mine to be here.
Welcome, welcome. So obviously, as part of International Women's Day, each year there's a key theme, and each year there's a lot of focus, especially around the week that the day falls. And I've decided this year I'd like to continue the conversation. So I'm interviewing people like yourself from all over Australia around what it means, what Break the Bias means to you, and how you live it and integrate it within your day. So might as well kick off with that question in general. When you hear that phrase, break the bias, what do you automatically think about or feel?
Okay, so great question to start off with, Catherine. So I think when I hear that term break the bias, I think to myself, that's a fantastic topic. But I feel my kind of feeling reaction is, oh, that's a hard topic as well, right? So I know intuitively, and I think through my experience now, that it's an important topic to talk about and to debate and understand further. But I feel it's hard, inherently quite difficult. It's not necessarily something people feel comfortable talking about, particularly in a workplace setting. So, and I think fundamentally that's because I believe that bias is sort of nurtured and built up over a number of years. It's not something people pick up last week. It's not a trend. It's something that's, that you build within yourself over usually many, many, many years. And so therefore, I won't say it's something that's dear to people. I don't think it's that kind of thing, but it's part of who people are, right? So
you're right. It's ingrained in your makeup. It's part of who you are, and you act out on bias without even thinking, without even consciously realizing that you're actually doing it. And I think to your point, the conversation is a great thing to be having, as difficult as it is, because quite often we think we are breaking the bias by leading by example, but in reality, without incorporating the conversation around that, we may not actually be breaking the bias at all.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fascinating. So how do you become consciously aware of what your biases are?
Yeah, I think fundamentally, for me, the sort of eye-opening moment was having children of my own, or a child of my own. So I think my upbringing, when I reflect back on it now, was, very traditionally dominated by a strong male father figure. So my father, I'm from the UK. My father was in the police force in the UK. He very much, made the decisions in the house. He was the person who worked full time. My mother was a traditional housewife, as was the case in those days. She did work a little bit part-time, but, her role was to keep the house and make sure that my brother and I don't have any sisters, were well fed. Dinner was always on the table at 6 o'clock. So all the things that you could throw into that sort of stereotypical existence of a family was my upbringing. That's what I knew. I didn't know any different to that. And a strong principle, I guess, in this whole topic is, clearly I can't change my upbringing. I can change what I think about that now. I can't go back in time, even if I wanted to. Not that I necessarily would. So that was my upbringing. And then, when I got married and had a child, we had a daughter. And she's almost 12 years old now, and I've seen over the last 12 years, I've been part of a very different family environment, quite the opposite to the one I grew up in. My wife has worked almost always, at least almost full time during that period, and the experiences and the interactions I've had with my daughter and watching her grow up and go through the first part of education and schooling and interactions there has made me reflect back and realise that a lot of the opinions and beliefs that I bring into my daily life and logically into the workplace were founded on that upbringing, which was inherently biased towards a sort of male-dominated perspective.
Very much gender stereotypes, wasn't it? Because I was raised in a very similar environment. In that there was a generation where that was just how the world worked predominantly.
Yes.
Have you had any, you or your wife, are there any conversations that you've had with your daughter around stereotyping based on gender or anything like that?
I think this is where I've sort of started to see that play out in the last 5 or 6 years of my life, is watching her interact at school and starting to have those interactions. And it starts super early, right? And you start to see it come through with the boys playing soccer in the playground. And I'm a proud Englishman. I've played soccer all my life, and I kick a ball around with my daughter and have done since she could stand up. And yet her reluctance to want to play in the playground because that's what the boys do was sort of an early indication to me that despite in my lifetime a fair bit of progress being made in terms of gender diversity, I would say, still these very basic distinctions between male and female are being reinforced very early on in the education system. So I've started to see that come through, and then started to listen to her interact and talk about her experiences. And there's a definite strong gender distinction that starts there, I think, in primary school, and whether or not enough's being done to counter that, I don't know. But certainly at home, we're having those conversations, and my goal, of course, is that she should grow up in a diverse and inclusive world. And so, I ask, what I think are relatively provocative questions of her, and try and get her to come to the realization that any form of bias from a gender perspective is unnecessary. There's no reason why she shouldn't take part in any of the sports she wants to. There's no reason why the girls have to group over one side of the playground and the boys the other and do separate things. So certainly started to see that play out at home.
Brilliant. What are some of the provocative questions that you ask her? If you're willing. Oh, now I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I will say, so why are you not taking part there? And she'll say, well, because the boys don't pass to me. They sort of resist. And I said, well, you have to counter that. You have a right to counter that. Surely, if you want to play sports of any kind, you should be able to. Do you agree that that's right, or do you think that the boys should just play on their own? And I think, it's early days. She's a young human being, but I think she's starting to see and question things a lot more. I'm a child of the 70s, but my experiences as a child are founded by movies of the 80s, right? So
yes.
I love sharing those movies with her. And so we watched the first Indiana Jones movie quite recently, which is a great movie, super fun. Yeah. But the stereotypes in there are amazing. And without any prompting from me, she started to point them out. She's going, well, there's this strong lead female character in that movie, but because of the nature of the story, she spends most of the movie in what is effectively a white wedding dress with white stilettos. And she sort of reflected halfway through the movie, why on earth is she wearing that dress? This is ridiculous.
It's not practical.
It's not practical. She can't help save the day wearing those ridiculous heels. Right? So then we sort of had this conversation around these traditional movies with this strong male character, and how even that's changed so much, even in Hollywood. But things like that are really interesting.
Yeah, and how exciting is that to be able to have those conversations? But also, doesn't it highlight how ingrained in our upbringing those stereotypes were? Like we were absorbing it, not just at home, we were absorbing it everywhere. The TV shows that we watched, the movies that we watched, it was just in our faces. And it's wonderful that she can start to pick those things up and have those conversations.
Yeah, it's good. And it's nice now that I think it's coming from her a bit more. So starting to ask the question and challenge. And I think that's such a massive part of this whole topic, because bias is sort of reinforced, I think, by the fact that it's hard for some people to speak up. And one of the big aspects of breaking the bias is giving everybody the opportunity and actively encouraging them to have their say and to contribute, I think.
And to listen to that contribution as well. So there's one side is allowing them to have their say and to speak up, but the other side of that is actually listening to it and doing something with that new information and perspective. Amazing. Have you ever caught yourself out or have been caught out by another acting on a bias?
So the answer is yes. So about 10 years ago, I was actually working over in New Zealand, and I did a 360-degree feedback exercise, very common, of course, in the workplace for leaders. I've been pretty successful in my career up to that point. I was considered to be a fairly strong leader and did well in staff engagement surveys and the like. And I did this 360 feedback exercise. And what came through very strongly, to my surprise, was a fairly universal theme that said that I tended to make relatively quick decisions based on sort of a small amount of evidence and a small amount of opinion. And so I sort of explored that theme further and, started to realise that I was driven by a desire to make quick decisions and that I didn't need large amounts of information to make decisions. I just needed a small amount of confident information, which tended to typically come from whoever spoke first and loudest in a decision-making process. I learned and spent time understanding that to make better decisions, you want a diverse series of viewpoints, but you also need to counter probably your natural bias. And so being broader in my information gathering in the way that I interact with my team and ensuring that literally everybody is actively asked to have a point of view. They may not want to share anything, that's fine, but actively giving people that voice is a great way to counter what might be a well-intended bias, because bias isn't necessarily going to lead to a bad outcome. It's just it's by definition narrow.
Yes, yeah, correct. You spoke about the system, as in the education system, and that those stereotypes were playing out even within the education system, or you have seen that with your own daughter.
Yeah.
Have you seen that more broadly within the organisations that you've worked with, in even in building your career? If you reflect back, have you seen bias play out, and in what ways?
Look, I have, Catherine, and I am conscious. I'm a white male, and so many of the biases that exist in the workplace have probably favoured me in my career. If I'm honest. Having said that, I've also seen bias exist that's sort of gone against me and others. So not necessarily the organisation I work for now, but more broadly in my career, I've seen absolute evidence of gender bias, the traditional boys' club, but even within that, boys' clubs within boys' clubs that are more specific to, people knowing other people. So I'm an accountant by trade, and so you've got, a pool of accountants, but within that, I've seen bias towards certain groups of people based on either literally their education, upbringing, or their proximity, leaders that they work for, which is very interesting in today's times, because obviously with the technology that you and I are using now through all of our experiences with COVID, we all have work from home capabilities. So the actual idea that people are going to congregate in a single office in a single place 5 days a week is almost gone completely now. And yet that's some of the bias I've experienced, where the leader's been, in another location, and I haven't been that person sat next to them, and that's ultimately been to my disadvantage. So I've certainly seen plenty of bias play out in the workplace. Having said that, I certainly there would be people out there with bigger fish to fry than my personal experiences. But
sure, yeah, it's interesting that you talk about, as you say, the technology now and our ability to work from anywhere and being more virtual, and some organisations ensuring or encouraging people to use video, whereas others not. And that was one of the things that I kind of touched on very early in the pandemic, was this, I guess this, what could be seen as a disadvantage of not being visible, not being noticed. Yep. So, if you're not there, then, it's hard enough already when you are there to be noticed and to make it to a mark. If you are in one of those groups, or whether it be race or gender, that are fighting harder than perhaps others, when you are no longer visible, you need to become more visible in different ways and create different networks. And so you're right, it's a very interesting dynamic, and it'll be interesting to see how bias begins to play out in this remote working environment.
I think that's exactly right. And I think we're yet to see how this will play out. It could actually lead to strengthening of some bias in the workplace, because we have some companies who are making a stance strongly one way to say everyone can work from home. And then you've got other companies taking a stance the other end, encouraging people back on a very regular basis, and everybody else in between. So what's that going to mean for employees in the future who find themselves in an organisation where perhaps their way of working is not aligned to the majority, and how will they be treated, and what will they need to do to strengthen connections? Because I believe particularly in the examples that we're talking about here, that strength of connection is fundamentally the important thing, whether that's face-to-face in the same geographical location or through the use of technology. But really important for leaders to ensure that they're connecting equally across their employee base, across their teams, and not being led down a path of bias, dealing only with the people that are in front of them. And this is really hard for leaders, right? Because there are employees who will naturally promote themselves and put their opinions forward and so on and so on. And that's a good thing. But as a leader, you've got to try and extract maximum inclusion from those who don't naturally do that themselves, I think.
You're right. And leading virtually is quite different to leading physically in the same location. There's a lot more emphasis and effort on, as you say, staying connected and communicating. So that's additional time in your day that you probably don't already have. So it is going to be very easy to fall into that bias of spending more attention and time with the people that are physically there as opposed to the people that aren't.
And I think there's a big distinction here between formal and informal connection as well. So what's been clearly proven is through the use of technology, we can formally, as you and I perhaps are doing here, converse and discuss work matters and so on and so forth. So in theory, there's no reason why that shouldn't be as strong as doing that face-to-face with someone. The informal connections that usually come about through being in the same physical location, a classic water cooler conversation, or somebody who passes some cakes around the office, or a situation that leads to laughter in the office. These are things that strengthen connections, strengthen bonds with people, potentially create a bit of bias there, and are harder to emulate through virtual technology, I think. So I think leaders have got to work hard at creating informal connections virtually as well. Agree.
And that's where that time, that balance of time comes into play as well, because you can create those. I mean, they're not as spontaneous, but you still can create those virtual element, those social elements in a virtual environment. You can get quite creative, but as you say, they're not quite as spontaneous. What are some of the things that you do to be more conscious of and continually challenge your own bias?
Yeah, I think probably three things in the workplace, and then maybe I'll talk about my family. But from a workplace perspective, I think first and foremost, it's as simple as going around the room in any interaction, meeting, forum that may occur. I think giving everybody the opportunity, actively prompting people to give a perspective, I think firstly and fundamentally is the first thing that I do. Classically, in office environments that I've worked in where there are agendas for meetings, there would typically be an AOB or any other business as the last item on the agenda. But I've seen over many years that that's just something that's a token thing, that is essentially there to try and capture whether anyone's got anything to say be in the last 10 seconds of the meeting. Whereas actually it's a very powerful way of asking whether anyone has an additional contribution or anything to raise that hasn't previously been taken into account. And so I find that, if used properly and given the appropriate time, a really powerful way to literally include everybody in the interaction. I think with the use of technology, where you haven't got those human cues that you can get from body language and face-to-face eye contact, literally, it's even more important to very systematically make sure that everybody is included in all aspects of workplace interactions. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think, super important to try and do that as a team and as a collective of people. So an individual leader can get so far there, but it needs to become a mantra to a broader group of people, I think, and the way they interact. So I'm fortunate to have leaders who work for me who have teams underneath them, and so making it a principle of the way that we operate. So having these kind of social contracts in the way that we conduct meetings and having that explicitly on the wall or virtually communicated, I think is important. So everybody knows that, if you're a part of this broader team, in my context, 150 odd people, then everybody's expected to behave in that way. So I think you make it a sort of principle or a part of the culture of the team. And then the third thing, I find facts are really useful as a way to counter bias. One of the challenges I found with bias is it's very easy to Google headline statistics and pieces of information, and they're great for selling media. But the degree to which those statistics that are often quoted apply to an organisation or a team within an organisation are worth exploring, I think. So gender pay gap, for example, is a topical item of discussion at the organisation I currently work for. And what I found there is, Googling gender pay gap statistics for Australia as a country is probably not quite a deep enough level of information. We need to bring that into this company, and then within that understand the composition and the mix with teams and why that may have occurred. And so getting into some factual information, I think, is an important principle as a way to not necessarily counter bias, but to talk more informatively about how perceived bias may or may not be playing out in the situation that anyone is in.
Yeah, and perception plays a huge part, right? Because what one person perceives will be very, very different to another that's within the same team, what they've experienced, what they've seen. Yeah. Which
is why I was going to say, which is why I think having some facts, having up-to-date data and arming people with that is a great way to help explore those topics further and make them meaningful, as opposed to sort of debating a point of principle, which almost becomes a sort of social or political piece of conversation. I think in the workplace it's helpful to deal with real statistical facts.
And perhaps makes it a little less emotive too, right? When you having a real conversation where you can see that the leader genuinely cares and wants to talk about this and talk about ways that we can navigate it with the facts and with the data, that can actually help alleviate some of that emotion, where you tend to grab those headline stats and comments that you see.
It's hard, isn't it? Because emotion, this great human quality that we all have, which creates great highs in our life, but also some lows. Like emotion in the workplace is almost seen as a sort of a negative or a thing to be wary of, and yet we desperately try and harness passion. We want passion. We want everybody to bring passion to the workplace and to our customer objectives. But beware emotion, because emotion can, so it's an interesting fine line, I think, between emotion.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I agree with you that it is, there's a lot of conversation around, and has been for quite a number of years, around bringing your authentic self. And that means bringing all of you, including your emotions. So I'm certainly not saying emotions are a bad thing at all. Emotions are great when they can be harnessed in a constructive way.
Yes.
And it's how you can create that environment.
But it's interesting, isn't it? As leaders, we go on training courses sometimes, and we're we try and define our leadership styles, and then we have a different measure of our leadership style under a stressful situation, and that's a way of determining how people lead in stressful situations. And yet the same is probably true with emotion. Emotion often can be a reason why bias comes to the forefront, in the same way as a stressful situation leads to certain reactions in the workplace. Emotions are the same. And so in a very calm, measured state of mind, absolutely, I can talk very reasonably about bias and be super inclusive. But maybe when I'm stressed or I'm emotional, I default to a state that is more bias driven, and sort of recognizing that is important, if nothing else. Right?
It is. And I love that you've touched on that, because, that is actually scientifically proven that when we are in a state of emotion, we aren't able to access that conscious thought process, that logical, rational part of our brain, because it kind of almost gets shut off when we're stressed or in an emotional state. So we are very much going to default to all of our habitual behaviours, and that is where our bias sits. So I love that you've brought that up, because what does that mean for us as leaders? How can we, I guess, increase our awareness of when we're in an emotive state, and therefore maybe perhaps we shouldn't be making certain decisions when we're in those states? What are your thoughts?
Right. But try telling someone who's highly emotive to take a step backwards and think about it tomorrow. It's hard, because often those are the times at which challenging conversations happen in place. But I think with all of this recognition, and I think through the International Women's Day conversations, the acceptance of the existence of bias was a big part of the sessions that I listened to and were part of there. Almost that Alcoholics Anonymous piece of saying, step one is to admit you're an alcoholic. Well, step one here is we all have bias. And as we just beginning, that's built up potentially over many years and isn't something necessarily to be ashamed of, but certainly to be aware of, and to try and assess how that bias impacts how we behave and interact in the workplace and more broadly in society.
Brilliant. I love it. So what are some of the things that, especially with your role in Women Connect, what are some of the things that your organisation are doing to help break that bias?
So the group that I'm part of is focused on gender, and so gender diversity and gender equality. So there's a lot happening throughout the organisation. One of the things that is at the forefront of that is making targets explicit, and targets can be a dividing topic, but leaders at this organisation are effectively incentivized as part of their performance targets to achieve certain outcomes that are more gender equal. Now, the work that the group that I'm involved in do is sort of on the periphery of that. It's not specifically driving at those outcomes per se, but given as that's sort of the umbrella or the headline environment, there is an appetite across the organisation to therefore look for opportunities to become more inclusive from a gender perspective. And so one of the areas that we've been looking at is the sponsorship of women, and this actually came out of a session that you ran with some of the people here some time ago. And so I think we've got to focus around understanding that has been, for a variety of reasons, a bias towards sponsoring males in organisations, to sponsoring their development, and this is sponsorship as distinct to mentoring. So this is about actively, proactively looking to take talented, motivated females and to look for career progression opportunities for them and with them, and having somebody, an advocate in the organisation sponsor and actively try and fulfil the potential of those individuals. And statistically, we know that men are more likely to actively do that.
Yes.
And there's probably a lot of reasons for that, and I'm not an expert on that, but that certainly seems to be how that's played out. And so we're looking to try and counter that by having a formal sponsorship program for females. And it's been interesting going through, I work for a large organisation, but it's interesting going through the various stages of bringing that to life. So I think there's an overarching acceptance and understanding and desire to want to do something. But one quickly runs into some challenges, right? How do you make that happen? Who's going to, how does that fit with other policies that exist in an organisation? What does that mean for males? Are we going to do something for male sponsorship at the same time, and so on and so forth? So it's been interesting exploring that kind of a topic, but so far so good, and I think it will ultimately help challenge one of many biases that I think exists there.
And that's the conundrum, isn't it, when we look at putting in formal frameworks to help eliminate bias, whether it be gender, race, able-bodied, whatever that looks like. When we go around trying to fix what we could say is a broken system, how do we make sure that we're not looked to be favouring a gender, a race, an able-bodied person at the detriment of historically the group that have just naturally been given those advantages through no fault of their own, simply because of our societal biases that have assisted them in that way. So it is a problem that we need to kind of, it's the elephant in the room almost, really, isn't it?
I think it is, because the reality is I'm a male, and so to be, for me personally, for my personal career growth, a sponsorship program for females isn't helping me really. And so I think we have to appeal to the fact that we're all part of a society, and every one of us, however we identify, will be friends with, be relatives with people of alternative genders, and it's simply got to be the right thing to do to stamp out inequality or to promote inclusivity as much as we can. And I think when you have that conversation with people, they come to the same realization. And so it's about taking your personal self slightly out of the equation and look at a slightly bigger picture. And I do believe, through the interactions I've had, that the vast majority of people fundamentally do believe in equality and inclusion, and they think it's the right thing, and they are appalled by history and what history tells us about how that's played out. Are all those people at the very front trying to make that change? Not necessarily, but I think there's a lot to be able to leverage there from the vast majority of people.
And I think it's why these conversations are so important to continue, whether it's whether it's part of a formal event like International Women's Day, or whether it's something less informal. They're conversations that we need to keep having, because, as you know, my fundamental belief is that these biases are actually ingrained in our culture, and that's where we need to start making that shift in all elements of our culture, not just in the workplace, not just in the schooling system, not just at home. It's got to be a very broad sweep, and the only way we're going to do that is by actually having those conversations and challenging those systems and frameworks that we have.
I think that's like, I look at, to come back to my own daughter, I'm very positive, and I have a good feeling about the world she's growing up in and her ability to have an equal playing field. And so I certainly better than it would have been 20 years ago. And I take that as a positive. And whilst there's still an awful lot to do to progress equality, I think currently there's a lot happening, which is positive.
And to your point, whether it's probably not happening as fast as people would like, but at the very beginning of our conversation, we spoke about how ingrained bias is in our makeup, that for the majority of us, we don't even know we're enacting on it. So it's not until we have conversations like we're having now that we can start to increase our awareness around what it is. But then it takes time to change. People don't change overnight. Communities, cultures don't change overnight. But it's about making sure that we continue to move in that direction. It's not something we just pull out once a year and tuck away again.
And I think just from a business perspective for a second, it's in most companies' interests, I would think, to have a workforce that is representative of the customer base that it serves, right? So depending on the nature of a business, the odds are that the customer base it's seeking to meet the needs of is probably a pretty diverse customer base. And so you would think that logically you would want a workforce that is equally reflective of that. Yeah. So I think just from a business sense, it intuitively makes sense as well.
Yeah, I agree. But it's a tough one. It's a tough one to break. So
hey, I had a quick question for you, if that's okay. This is a bit spontaneous as well, but International Women's Day, obviously break the bias was the theme. Probably for the first time in my knowledge anyway of IWD, there seemed to be a bit of negative press coverage around even the existence of International Women's Day and having to have a day and having to have a hashtag theme. And I wondered if you had personally any thoughts on that and where you see that going in the future, and whether or not you think that was whether you think that media kind of feedback there had any real impact to the success or otherwise of the day.
Great questions. And I guess the first thing that comes to mind is, that old saying around any kind of media is good.
Yeah. No, there's no such thing as bad press.
That's right. But it's interesting, right? I've always, and I have for a little while, I've always had mixed emotions about International Women's Day. I think that it is important to have a day to highlight the issues, the challenges, the opportunities that we have, whether it's within our organisations, our own homes, our communities. But on the flip side of that, is it really making any massive impact? I'm not even sure how many years it's been. I know that I've been attending International Women's Days events for well over a decade.
Yeah.
And so you could ask the question, what real impact are they having? And look, we do have an International Men's Day, but again, it doesn't have the same hype. It doesn't get the same attention. I also, with the negative media that you were talking about and the negative attention it was getting, I do wonder whether that in itself was bias that was playing out. When you look at some of the reporting within our media around female CEOs versus male CEOs, female politicians versus male politicians, there is always a very thick and heavy bias that plays out when people are reporting on women of note. And so potentially that was some of that bias playing out in that negative media. But I do always come to International Women's Day with quite mixed feelings of my own. And I actually read quite a prominent female wrote, or successful female, I should say, on LinkedIn wrote I'm breaking up with International Women's Day post. And I could feel everything she was saying there. honestly, that, you know, they are some of those mixed emotions that I have with the build up to the day and the week, and then everything subsides. So I can certainly resonate with that aspect of it, but at the same time, I think it's still important to be having these conversations.
I think for me, the important thing as you're doing is to continue the conversation.
It's like Valentine's Day, right? And it's an excuse. It's an excuse to make an effort with your partner because you've done nothing the rest of the year. It's like, it's that one day, and I don't support or agree with international with Valentine's Day or Mother's Day for that matter, because there's such a commercialism to it. So it's kind of the same thing, but it is important to bring attention to it. And if that's the one avenue we have at the moment, then until we come up with something better, that's the avenue we have. All right, great question. We'll finish on this one question with you. Why do you think it's important that we break the bias? Like, why is breaking the bias such an important topic?
Because it's our default. I believe the recognition of that in ourselves is massively important, and therefore we have to and should have some kind of counter coping mechanism, something that can bring some balance to a situation. I think it is unrealistic to completely stamp out bias. We all have experiences and a rich history of life that makes us who we are, and that I'm sure brings out some amazing, wonderful qualities in all of us. But but I think balance is the key word for me. We need to find balance between the real positives that exist in bias and something to offset where there are some things that are not as positive.
Beautiful. I love it. Well, thank you again for being part of the series and for your time. I really appreciate it.
No problem. My absolute privilege and honour. And carry on doing your amazing work, Kath.
Thank you. I appreciate it.